Welcome to the Backyard Professor live Sunday evening sessions. I am here with my good friend Steve Pinecker. Steve, how you doing?
I'm doing really great, BYP. You're so awesome. I'm so glad that we have this opportunity for me to be a co-host on your program tonight.
Well, I am very grateful you are my co-host. We've had a lot of fun together, and I'm looking forward to many more years of fun together. So fess up. This is your first actual live, isn't it?
Yes, with the exception of hopping on Mormonism Live for 3 minutes to promote the movie screening last month of Elder Pingree movie with Rebecca. That's the only time this will be the only time I've done live.
Yeah, okay,
really live because I can interact.
To you both barrels, brother. So
All
this
right.
is
let's do this.
We have a wonderful guest on tonight. We are going to, here in a few minutes, we are going to bring on Jonathan Neville, and we are going to learn about his version of what is called the Heartland theory, although just like he's just recently been telling us, technically he's not a Heartlander, but he has some idea. You know, there's various views of Heartland information, and looks like we've got a good crowd tonight. Why don't we get this started with the good stuff? Of course, my opening that absolutely everybody says, why do you play an opening? We all just skip it. However, you and I won't. So here we go. Right. Let's get this show on the road, people. Yeah, baby. That's for you, Mark Crispin. Steve, I'm just looking at hold on, let me turn this noise up so that people can hear me yammer. I am just looking at the chat. Hello, everybody. Wave to hi to everybody. Gene Judson, Doug, Vincent, Newton, Lemnos, Radio Free Mormon, Jewel Brown, Tim Rathbone, Dan Vogel, Doug Vincent, Jewel Brown, Peter Higgs, Newton Lemon. I said Newton already, didn't I? Dan Vogel. I said Dan Vogel. You guys are all awesome. You're all here. We're looking forward to Richard Nugent, Gail Capson, Heather Reddick. Good to see you. Marcella McLeon, Holy Toledo, Heather Reddick. Good to see you. Okay, it looks like we've got at least 3 people here. Hey, Steve Pinecker is with me co-hosting tonight. He does the world famous, world valuable, the presidents of the countries greet this man with great respect. No, you run the Mormon book reviews, don't you? Yeah.
Mormon book reviews. We just celebrated our 2-year anniversary. And just to think that, but then over the course of the last year, we're probably one of the fastest growing Mormon podcasts in the world now. It's pretty wild.
Awesome. And Mormonish podcast, Rebecca. Yep. Speaking of Rebecca, or is that Jordan? I don't know, or both. Welcome to you both. I'm going to be having them on next Sunday. Yeah, so that'll be fun too. But for now, and Paul Osborne. Welcome, Paul. Good to see you too.
Hey, Carrie, can I just say, first of all, those are a lot of names I know too. They comment on a lot of my stuff. They're familiar names. So I want to say hi to everybody in the chat as well. It's good. I'm looking forward to getting feedback from y'all. And Carrie, just a quick question. How you doing? I'm your co-host, so I'm going to interact with you. I want to know, how you doing today?
Me?
Yeah.
I am doing great. I've got a confession to make.
Okay.
See this, the LDS Gospel Topics series by our friend Matthew Harris and Newell G. Bringhurst. I saw John DeLynn with a podcast with Matthew Harris talking about the historic, philosophic, religious backgrounds, what led up to the gospel essays being put on the church website. And I'm all the way 3/4 through this, and I just started it this morning. I just got it yesterday in the mail, and I can't put the thing down. John DeLynn was right when he said this is a great read. But I also wanted to do a quick shout out to my other dear friend, Trevin Hatch. He is a BYU professor, and this is his book, A Stranger of or in Jerusalem. It's about the Jewish aspects of Jesus. And then with Eric Huntsman, he also did no greater love hath no man. And this is about the Easter story. And so I'm enjoying those. And then I've got to show off books. I'm the backyard professor. You're the Mormon book review guy. So, we jive here. And then this one, Producing Ancient Scripture. I got this one a couple weeks ago in Salt Lake when I was with you and Rebecca on Elder Pingree. So, and that's from Mark Amherst McGee, Brian Haglid, and Michael Hubbard McKay. There are some really interesting stuff here. Yeah. This is the one, just for my audience, this is the one where Thomas Wayment demonstrates conclusively now that Joseph Smith did have access and did utilize Adam Clark in his JST. So new developments, new ideas. So.
It is, but that doesn't. What's so fascinating is, Joseph Smith was influenced by the milieu and the world and the people. And one of the things that's so exciting about this guest is that we have somebody that's willing to engage the idea that Jonathan Edwards had a major influence on the translation process of the Book of Mormon. So if you're a faithful Mormon, this is the thing. You don't have to get caught up in these things as being necessarily anti. You can also say that if Joseph Smith was a translator, and he was also a human, and he was also inspired, that of course he's going to use the language of many of the people of his time. It's not necessarily should be viewed, and I don't think Joseph Smith was looking at himself as a plagiarist. I think he was looking at them as being inspired, and thus he was inspired by them as well.
Yeah, we just happen to have a world-class scholar with us tonight. Let's bring him on. That actually does demonstrate some Jonathan Edwards parallels. We might get him to talk a little bit about that, but tonight we want to hear his ideas on the Book of Mormon. There he is. Take a bow, Jonathan Neville. And the crowd.
I'm actually sitting down, so I can't really bow. But
yeah, Steve didn't bow either, and I didn't either, so it's all good.
Okay. How's that for you?
How you doing tonight?
I'm doing great. Good to be with you guys.
It is fun to have you on the show. I want to thank Steve for introducing you to us and getting you excited to be on the show. Now I'm going to make a confession, probably a bad confession, but I'm going to make it anyway. I am relatively new to this subject on the Heartland. And so this has been a really exciting week for me, a week of discovery. I've been watching so many of your video podcasts with Steve and with, who is the gentleman that runs the Quick, CWIC?
Greg Martin.
Yeah, I've been watching several of your interviews with him, Jonathan, and I've been looking at you've been on a lot of programs, so I'm very grateful that you've chosen to come on my humble little abode and let's talk turkey. Oh, wait, no, that's not one of the animals in the Book of Mormon.
Yeah, let's closer to Easter than Thanksgiving at this point. So,
yeah, so really exciting, Carrie, to have this opportunity to be your co-host today. And I reached out to you on last week's episode after it aired. And Rebecca had mentioned about the possibility of me being a co-host, and of course you guys were talking about the Salt Lake Tribune article earlier that day that had talked about the Yerman Thummim book that just coming out, written co-authored by Jonathan Neville and James Lucas. And so I put two and two together. I'm on the phone with you. I'm like, dude, let's just get Jonathan Neville on because he's a really interesting dude. And you had told me you had just read something the day before about it. And you were like, yeah, let's do this. And then, of course, you've spent the last week watching the videos, learning about Jonathan and how really he's an original thinker. And can I just tell a quick story? Can I finally tell my Richard Bushman story?
Yeah. Go ahead. Tell your hey, just for the audience sake, seriously, y'all know who Richard Bushman is. He is a truly Mormon historian who is good. He jumps into all kinds of stuff. Some people like him, some people don't. But Steve has a story that he told me and Jonathan, and we both went, "Oh, interesting." So, Steve, you've got the floor for 10 seconds, and then over to Jonathan.
So, but what's so important here is when I first started my channel, I started engaging Jonathan. I engaged him before I even started my channel by watching him on Rod Melbourne and then watching him do other videos. And I found this is a really fascinating guy. So I'm attending the Book of Mormon Perspective Forum that meets every single Monday night. And Jonathan was given a presentation. And he started talking about this idea of a Jonathan Edwards, the great evangelical theologian, having an influence on the dictation, on the translation process of the Book of Mormon. I'm like, whoa, this sounds really interesting because now we're talking about my world, the evangelical world, right? And so I start talking to Jonathan, and I do my first interview with him. Well, then I meet Richard Bushman at the Mormon History Association. I asked him if he'd come on my program. He said yes immediately. And then a week or two later, we're taping. So I taped my interview with Richard Bushman again. I had like 100 subscribers. And afterwards, we're done taping. And I go to him and I say, what do you think about this Jonathan Neville? Because Jonathan had told me that he had met with Richard. And Jonathan, literally, there was a change in Richard's demeanor where he kind of had this sparkle in his eyes. And he just said, Jonathan Neville. He's a radical thinker in the best sense of the term. He's onto something with those plates and with the translation process with Jonathan Edwards. He said he was praising you effusively, praising Jonathan. Now I've kept this story to myself because I only tell it now because of the endorsement he did of Jonathan's latest book. I got a reader's copy and I read this, the endorsement to.
Now, what book is that? Hold it up so we can see the title.
By means of the Urim and Thummim.
So that's your newest one, isn't it, Jonathan?
Yeah, that just came out. The subtitle is Restoring Translation to the Restoration.
Okay. And Bushman writes a blurb on the back here. So now Bushman is out as endorsing Jonathan.
Oh, I see.
So I feel now I can tell that story that Richard Bushman, when I knew Richard Bushman was on board, and then I get these people pushing back at me when I go to MHA and say I'm friends with Jonathan Neville and they roll their eyes. They're not rolling their eyes anymore, folks.
Yeah,
because of the contributions that Jonathan has made.
I realize, though, that Hannah Stoddard and some of them don't like Bushman. I'm just saying, be careful. We're playing with fire. Now, Bushman's a fun historian. I've gotten quite a few of my friends and neighbors to read him Bushman too. So, and Dan Vogel, I will say, hey, Dan Vogel's in the house. Thank you for showing up, Dan. He had, fine business operator. I see you too, my friend. Got to say hi to him. Vogel's new book is at the print shop. So truly, it's going to be 800 pages thick. We're talking bigger than Rough Stone Rolling as far as the number of pages now. So Vogel has put his heart into this thing for several years. They're hoping to have it out before the MHA in May, so that they can talk about it. So we've got some fun things to look forward to. You know, all these historians, Jonathan here and Vogel and everybody has completely different nuances in some things. Others are complete loggerheads. Others, they mesh well. And that's what makes this fun.
Yeah.
So Jonathan, it's your turn to share with us and teach us some of your interesting ideas on this Heartland model. Now, why do you call it Heartland, and how does it compare with we know there's a Mesoamerican model, right, and you say a Heartland model. This isn't the Heartland of Mesoamerica, I take
it. Yeah. Okay. So the Heartland is, when we talk about the Heartland model, is referring to the Heartland of Central or North America, basically the United States, and today. And so, if you go through the Midwest, they call themselves the Heartland, and that's where it originated. The idea is that the Book of Mormon events took place primarily in North America once they left the Old World, of course. And the idea is that they left the Arabian Peninsula, went around Africa, across the Atlantic Ocean, and landed somewhere probably in Florida, maybe South Carolina, that's not sure, but most likely the Florida Panhandle area. And from there, went up to Tennessee, and then from there over to Ohio and across the Midwest, and ended up in New York, in the days of Kimora. So that's the basic. I have a little map here I could show you, but I don't know if maybe this is preliminary to do that, or should I just?
Sure, you can do that. And what I could do is, let's see if
I have it on a card here. So
go put it right up to your lights.
There we go.
There. That's
the sun's shifting on us here, but this is the overview of the area. And you can see
those are the Great Lakes up on top there.
Great Lakes at the top.
Okay.
Down here, you've got the Tennessee area.
Okay.
Oops, over here is, I'm doing it backwards here, but this is Illinois. And then you Ohio, Indiana, and on up to New York.
Okay.
So that's how we end up. I can see my sun is shifting, giving me some different shade here. But that's the overview of it. And there's lots and lots of nuances of this, lots of variations. I hear from people fairly often that have their own interpretation of how the Book of Mormon fits in North America. But the essence of it is the Hill Kimora in New York, or is it somewhere else? And that's the real dividing line between all the different theories, because you have some Latter-day Saints and other other restoration groups believe that the Hill Kimora is in New York, meaning the Hill Kimora of Mormon 6:6, where the final battles took place and the records were deposited and all that. Others think it was somewhere else. And you mentioned the Mesoamerica. There's lots of other ideas as well. There's one in Baja California. There's some in South America. I think there's one in Eritrea in Africa. I know there's been a Malaysian hypothesis.
Man, I mean, Moroni got around, didn't he?
Well, I mean, I'm just saying that, I did a blog post years ago where I pointed out that if the descriptions of the geography in the Book of Mormon are fairly vague, as they are in most ancient writings. Mm-hmm. I compared the Xenophon's Anabasis as an example. When I studied Greek, that's one we had to read. And if you didn't have a map, you wouldn't really know what he's talking about, how far they marched every day and so on. And since Mormon didn't give us a map, we're taking all these geographical clues, let's say, or passages, and we have to interpret them somehow. But there's a wide range of interpretation. And so that's why there's even those who agree that Kimora in New York have a wide range of opinions. The map that I showed you I would say, is probably the most widely accepted among people who believe Kimora in New York, but it's definitely not the only one. And I think, Carrie, you've talked to someone that had another alternative geography in the past.
I do, and I believe he's here in the chat, Paul Osborne. He's been looking at the Delmarva Peninsula.
Right, that's right. And there's another one, William Midgley, I think, that has one that I don't know if you've talked to him. Yeah. Anyway, so there's lots of them.
Sure.
And that all makes sense, But basic. So when you say Heartlander, it's a difficult rubric, because does that mean everybody who believes New York is where Kimora is a Heartlander, or is it only those that subscribe to a particular interpretation, like the map I just showed you? Is it purely focused on geography, or does it encompass other church history issues or even politics? I mean, there's all kinds of issues involved with that term. It's become a little bit of a loaded term.
Oh, has it?
Yeah, and so when I don't want to say I am or I'm not a Heartlander, because depending on who's using the term, I am or I'm not. So it's not
Your core to me appears to be that Kimora is in New York, and all else we're going to try to figure out.
Exactly.
Is that fair? It's a little interesting. Just this morning, my wife said, you're having that Jonathan Neville on for this Kimora, New York. I said, yeah, tonight. And she goes, check this out. I just got a brand new video on YouTube uploaded just yesterday, where they have hundreds of the missionaries in New York. Guess where? Kimora. And guess what they're doing? It's in New York. They're replanting all the trees. And they showed some old pictures of the hill that was completely covered. And they said, so we're replanting Kimora so that we can have Kimora back how Joseph Smith had it. So they think it's in New York. Kind of
Yeah,
interesting.
and it's funny. There's even some photos of Kimora from the late 1800s where there were no trees at all on it. So it's hard to say what it was like actually in 1830. But
I have a quick question about that. I always wondered, why would they have removed trees in the first place? Were they trying to farm that? What would have been the purpose of taking those trees out?
Well, the southern part of that, it's a glacial moraine basically, and the southern part is fairly flat and level, and so it was farmed. And as far as I know, nobody ever tried building terraces. It wouldn't be worth the effort because it's surrounded by farmland anyway. But the Native Americans typically would keep the highest hills denuded so they could send signals over long distances. And so I don't know how far back we know what the vegetation on Kimora was, but
Hey, can I ask you a quick question? It's just the Mormons basically that called it Kimora, though, isn't it? Didn't all their neighbors just call it Mormon Hill? Isn't that more of a Mormon thing with that hill?
Well, sure. Yeah. I mean, there was no Native American that was calling it Kimora before the Book of Mormon. Yeah.
I'm just making sure. I got to keep these guys.
Although, you could argue that Moroni was a Native American and he called it Moroni, or called it Kimora long before Joseph Smith came along. So in that sense, I'd say
kind of interesting.
We'll get into that maybe later tonight, but
sure. All right. So, okay, now let me, and this is, I'm not trying to go off topic here, but I just read something this week I've been dying to ask you. I'm not trying to throw a surprise question at you. I promised I'm not going to sabotage you here, but I do have a question that really kind of, we do know, I mean, Doug Vincent and I did that video on the Erie Canal here a couple of months ago, and he showed the geology of that particular area in New York. And we know that it is a glacial moraine. Those can't necessarily be hollowed out with great big rooms with tables full of gold plates and sort of Laban and stuff, can they? How does that work?
I hear that all the time, and I have two responses to it. One is there's a huge cave system all through upstate New York, and there's caves that are open to the public that people can go see. I
did not know that.
There's a big one in Rochester, and then there's one further east still in upstate New York. I don't know what the subterranean geology is around the hill Kimora, but the idea that these are just piles of rubble or something that were left is, I don't know where that idea came from, but I have actually dug into some of these moraines with a backhoe, and I can tell you they are pretty solid. They're mostly clay deposits, and in fact,
a bunch of pebbles and sand. Then,
well, on the very top there is, some.
Well,
but you go down 2 or 3 feet. If you go down 2 or 3 feet, you hit solid clay, and it's very difficult for even a backhoe to dig into. And so, and they're probably different ones. I mean, I've dug into a couple of them, and so they, it wouldn't be that difficult in a clay structure to build a supported chamber at all. I used to think that. I've heard that before.
But the trick is getting those gold plates from Mesoamerica into that room, pal.
Well, if you had to come all the way from Mesoamerica, that's a whole nother deal. But
I just real quick, Jonathan, I just, maybe give a little backstory too about how most of your life up until like the 90s or so, you would have considered yourself a Mesoamerican. Matter of fact, you even got like a copy of Sorensen's Mormons, would be later called Mormon's Codex. You had like an early version of that. You went down to Mesoamerica and looked at the structures and the ruins. So you becoming more interested in the idea that the events may have transpired in Heartland is a relatively new thing. And so maybe just talk about the evolution of that.
I appreciate that, Steve. Yeah, I will. So, I grew up in the church. After I was baptized when I was 9 anyway, but I was in a mixed faith family. And so they, we all learned the hemispheric model back in the day. And then when I went to BYU, we started hearing, I had a class from John Sorensen. We heard more about this limited geography in Central America. And that had a lot of appeal. It feels like I'm getting in the shade here. Let me I don't know. Anyway, so that had a lot of interest and appeal. And I used to go to all the Fair Mormon events and that Carrie was involved with early in the day. I got all the farms reports and so on. And in fact, when I went to law school, my last year in law school was the first year that Jack Welch became a professor there. And I was doing a joint program, and in my MBA classes, we were talking about the Hugh Nibley, seeking for Zion, and how do you reconcile that with a business or a legal career. And so I talked to Jack for quite a while at his office one day about all this, about the difference between reality versus our aspirations for establishing Zion. But I was a total fan. And so my first job out of law school was I clerked for the Chief Justice of the New Mexico Supreme Court in Santa Fe, New Mexico. And in our ward, there was an archaeologist. He and I became pretty good friends. But John Sorensen sent him his early manuscript for peer review. And it was all on, I copied the entire thing because I wanted to go through it myself, And so this would have been in the early 80s before it was actually published. And this archaeologist and I went through it, and I was fascinated by the whole thing, totally convinced, And then life happened, and I didn't pay that much attention to it. I just kind of assumed Mesoamerica was good. And then, I don't know, maybe 10 years, maybe it's a little more than that, I was writing a novel about how Native Americans were reclaiming their land under the treaties and the legal procedure and so forth. And a friend of mine...
Hebrews 2?
What's that?
View of the Hebrews 2, your novel?
No, this is modern day.
Sorry.
Now, that's an interesting idea. That'd be one to come up. Anyway, so he said, "Oh, you've got it." One of my readers said, "You've got to meet this guy, Rod Melbourne." And I'd never heard of him. And so he was a mutual friend. So he introduced me, and I was talking to Rod. And Rod said, "If you want to know about this, you need to go on a tour with us." And I've been, in my business career and other things, I've been all over the world. I've been to all the continents and, most countries, but I'd never really been to Ohio. And so he said, "You got to come on a tour to Ohio." And I said, "Great, let's do it." And I went out there, and for me, it was mind blowing because Wayne May was one of the tour guides along with Rod. And they showed me things.
May, is that the guy that does the Ancient America?
Yeah, he does the Ancient American. Yeah. And so I thought, wow, this is stuff I'd never heard before. And so I asked Rod, well, if this all seems to make sense, but how do we ever get tied up in Central America? With this Mesoamerican stuff. And he said, "Oh, it's because of these articles in the Times and Seasons." And so I started investigating those, and that's where I first embarked on this whole endeavor. And I thought that would be all I would ever do. Back in my kind of venture capital career, I worked with one of the richest guys in America that nobody's ever heard of, and he had a saying that was, "The spouting whale gets the harpoon." And so he none of his name or on any of his corporate documents, nobody knows how much property he owns and all this, and I thought, okay, am I going to be a spouting whale here by publishing a book about church history that goes against the narrative, the very first one? And I had talked with a couple of friends of mine who were emeritus general authorities, and they said, "No, you've got to publish this book. This is really a big deal to discuss these articles in the Times and Seasons." And so I actually met with Sherry Dew, and we discussed it. And she told me that she felt like she never really believed Joseph Smith could be an editor of the Times and Seasons. He wasn't a literary person. He never did editing, and he was busy and had all these other reasons. But she said, I just kind of went with it because that's what everybody told me. But she also said for her to publish my first book, it would have to go through correlation, which would take 18 to 24 months. And I was impatient. I figured I was only going to do one book. So I just said, no, let's do it. So I went with the publisher that I have now, and we published it fairly soon. And sure enough, I became a spouting whale. I attracted a lot of harpoons. And I figured, well, okay, this is just what I found. I'm not saying this is what it is. I'm saying this is my interpretation of the historical evidence, and it makes sense to me, Sure. And I'm not trying to convince anybody of anything, but
what was the name of that book, Jonathan? What was the name?
That was The Lost City of Zarahemla, the very first one.
Okay. That's one of the many of the 50 you've written that I'm going to have to spend $3,497.
There you go.
Yeah.
Only 3,000. You're getting a discount, brother.
Well, they're not on gold plates; they're on silver plates.
Okay, that's why. Okay, all right. So anyway, so I wrote the first one, and it had to do with this guy Benjamin Winchester, who was an early member of the church, and I'm convinced that he wrote the articles, submitted them to William Smith, who was the actual editor of the Times and Seasons at the time. And of course, the traditional historians were outraged by the whole thing, confronted me, wrote articles in the Interpreter and all that.
And this is to do with him.
They're still outraged.
What's that?
I'm sorry.
Go ahead. I can hear you.
I just want to clarify that he was when these in the Times and Seasons, they were publishing the idea of the Mesoamerica model, if you were, or Book of Mormon events or ruins were found in Mesoamerica, and it was thought that Joseph Smith was the editor and publisher of this. And Jonathan shows pretty conclusively that Joseph's fingerprints are not on it at all. That was one of the strongest arguments that they would use in favor of Joseph being in favor of a Mesoamerican model.
Yeah.
But wasn't he as the editor responsible? Wasn't he the one passing them off though? I don't know that might.
Well, it says on the boilerplate at the end of each newspaper says it was printed, published, and edited by Joseph Smith, but nobody thinks he was down there running the printing press. In other words, he was a nominal printer and he was a nominal editor. So in a sense, he was responsible. But I pointed out in my books that there were a couple of instances where he didn't even know it was in the newspaper until after it was printed. He went and picked it up and was reading it. And so that's far from being a hands-on editor.
Okay.
I don't need to get into the whole detail of Benjamin Winchester, but although it would be an interesting discussion to talk about the Times and Seasons. I ended up doing 3 books on it because after I did the first one, and my critics were all freaking out about it.
I've got that one. You're an advocate. And I did find those 7 letters. They're also messenger and advocate. You were telling us that a couple of days ago. So I've been looking into it and reading them. So
okay. Well, so I did my first book. The critics went nuts. And what had happened is I had a ton of material, but my publisher says no more than 300, 350 pages, because that's as much as someone will read. So after the harpoons started flying, I thought, well, I'll just publish the rest of it. And it was 2 additional books. But that would be a great topic to discuss someday. But right now, you wanted to focus on the geography. The only reason I bring that up is...
We'll have more with you.
Okay. But I bring that up because the Mesoamerican geography was based on the idea that Joseph Smith had endorsed the Mesoamerican setting. And so because of that, the tail started wagging the dog, and they started saying, well, if Mesoamerica was the setting, then Kimora is too far away to be the real Kimora, despite what Oliver Cowdery had said. And that's why to this day, the Mesoamerican advocates promote a limited geography in Mesoamerica, which is too far away from New York to be the scene. In fact, John Sorensen said something like, there are still a few Latter-day Saints who believe that I can't remember the term, but it was something like a witless sci-fi film to believe that the Nephites went all the way to New York from Central America. And that's how he phrased it. It's a witless sci-fi film. And so those kind of things I started looking at that and I thought, well, if we take Joseph Smith out of the equation of Central America, then what are we left with? And by the way, I've since shown that in the Wentworth letter, he refuted the Mesoamerican stuff, but that's another getting in the weeds too much, probably. But
we'll do another podcast on that.
Another broadcast. Okay. Well, I'd love to do that one, but so I got to watch out. My camera keeps adjusting as I put my hand up. The sun, I told you the sun was shifting on me.
You're getting beams of light coming at you from this angle. I'm scared of the beams of light that might come overhead. Like Joseph Smith. That's the one I'm watching for.
That's right. You should be watching for that. No, I'm sitting out here looking at the ocean and realizing the sun's going to be setting here.
You've got a view of the ocean right now, Jonathan?
Yeah, I live on the coast in Oregon.
Oh my gosh, spoiled rotten. No wonder you're so happy. That's awesome.
I'll tell you what, Carrie, I've lived in Europe, Asia, Africa, and I've traveled all over. I think the best place in the world is right here in Oregon. That's why I live here. because I could live
Steve
anywhere.
and I are
but
going to get together. We're going to come up. We're going to have some hot dogs
That's
with
right.
us on the beach.
I think you told me you've never even been to Oregon, which
I
is
have. No.
unbelievable. Well, you know what? You better be prepared to move if you do come over here.
Maybe I better wait for a few more years before I retire.
Yeah, probably so. Most Well, anyway, we have a lot of people who come here and they just plant themselves and look for a house, and there aren't many houses and so on, but they all want to live here because it's so awesome. But anyway,
so what
now I forgot what we were talking about. We were talking about the geography of Oregon or something.
Yeah, I think that's where the Hill Kimora is now, right?
Yeah, that's right. Okay. Now, what we were talking about was this idea that Kimoras in New York is too far away from Central America, and this idea really originated in the late 1800s with an RLDS scholar named Stebbins, and I think it's Henry A. Stebbins, and then he and another guy named Hills, Lewis A. Hills, developed what turned out to be a Tukumuras theory. And Hills actually created a map, published a map in 1917, where he showed the Book of Mormon events in Central Kimora, and he showed Kimora in southern Mexico. And in their discussion, they talked about how Oliver Cowdery, even though, he said Kimora was in New York, but he didn't know that much and he wasn't that credible. And, we're just going to go with this new theory. And so that's where it originated. Later on, LDS scholars picked up on it. John Sorensen credited Hills with being the first to locate Kimora outside of New York. Although a lot of the Mesoamerican advocates today don't know this, but it originated with these RLDS scholars. And so I looked at all these.
I recently found that out myself within the last couple of years. I mean, that's how far behind I am on the times.
You're not that far behind. Not many people seem to know this.
We've had some good discussions on Shade's message board. So
So anyway, I looked at this whole thing and I thought, okay, why do we think it was in New York? Where did that start from? And when I read the explanations on Fair Mormon or Fair LDS, whatever it is now, they were all saying, well, Oliver Cowdery said this, but he was wrong. And everybody was speculating, and it was a false theory that someone developed that Joseph Smith passively adopted when he wrote the letter in 1842 that's now DNC 12820. And none of that rang true to me. So I looked into it more and just came across this letter 7 that Oliver Cowdery wrote. It's one of these 8 letters. And I guess I should explain that a little bit, because in 1834, an anti-Mormon book called Mormonism Unveiled was published near Heartland, Ohio. And of course, it caused a lot of uproar. And one of the things in there it claimed was that the Book of Mormon was based on the Spalding novel. Solomon Spalding had written a novel explaining the mounds in Ohio. And so the Mormonism Unveiled said that's what Joseph Smith was reading from behind the veil. In other words, he had a curtain, he was behind the veil, he was reading the Solomon Spalding manuscript, and that's why it's called Mormonism Unveiled, to say what was behind the veil.
Oh, clever pun. I didn't know that. See, I've never even read that one. I just recently bought it from Sandra Tanner's bookstore before they closed.
Okay.
That's an interesting one. Okay.
Yeah, so he said it was fiction based on Solomon Spalding. So Oliver Cowdery fairly methodically went through and refuted the Mormonism Unveiled in a series of 8 essays, which he published as letters to W.W. Phelps. Kind of like, I don't know, Steve, these are these 8 letters, and Steve had a comment about the letters I thought was interesting. You want to share that?
Yeah, well, we were doing a Zoom call, and I was thinking about how it kind of rings as almost Pauline, or like Paul's epistles, letters that he wrote, that it almost appears to me that it almost has like an apostolic sense that you have this man who's one of the 3 witnesses is writing letters. And I almost feel like this is I just had this panel come on my program, Open Canon. Some of the top scholars of Mormonism came on to talk about.
It was a good panel, by the way. I watched it today.
It was, yeah. I enjoyed it.
It was great. But the idea that there's other canon, there's other scriptures out there that have been produced by other Latter-day Saint traditions, as well within the context of, like Claudia Bushman thinks that Lucy Mack Smith's stuff should be canonized. But I like the idea of epistles within the Mormon tradition, much like that parallels the Apostle Paul's. And I almost wonder if it was meant to be looked at that way as these. And if maybe if Oliver Cowdery and doesn't have his falling out with Joseph, maybe they would be a part of the Mormon canon. Maybe they still should be. But you said you're going to start calling them epistles because they kind of function in the same way that Paul's letters function in the early church.
Yeah, definitely. And after he had written the first three, I think he was ordained the assistant president of the church. And of course, he was the one who gave the apostolic charge to the apostles, the first 12 apostles, and he ordained them and so forth. So he was integral to the whole history of the church. And so he wrote these eight essays, which were published as letters. And it'd be fun to go through each one of them at some point. But letter 7 was the one where he talked about the hill Kimora in New York. And again, if you remember that he was refuting the idea that the Book of Mormon was a novel, he was explaining that, no, it was a real event and this is where it took place. And he said it was a fact that the hill Kimora, referred to in what is today Mormon 6:6, was the hill in New York where Joseph got the plates. And he said if you stand on the hill Kimora and look across the valley, it's about a mile wide. And he said it was in this valley that these final battles took place.
Cowdery was in the letter.
Yeah, Oliver Cowdery said that, yeah. And so when I read that, I thought, well, why are we even debating this? Here's the assistant president of the church writing in an official church newspaper, and he declares it's a fact. And the other interesting thing about Oliver Cowdery, he was serving his career was at the time as a justice of the peace there in Heartland. And he eventually became a lawyer. But he distinguished very clearly, very specifically between when he was speculating about something and when something was a fact. And I've published a little article about how all the times he used the word fact versus opinion or speculation. For example, he said he couldn't tell how deep the stone box that Moroni originally built on the hill Kimora was because Moroni had to accommodate erosion and debris on top of it. And so he talked about that a little bit as a matter of speculation. But he said it was a fact that these battles took place there. And so just reading that one letter in Messenger and Advocate that you just pointed out that you have, told me there's no wonder everybody thought it was a fact because he said it was a fact at the time. And so
all through here.
Yeah, it's all through here. So then one thing led to another, and it turned out it was copied into Joseph's journal as part of his life story. Joseph gave these essays to his brother Don Carlos to publish in the Times and Seasons, where they were published. Benjamin Winchester asked him if he could publish them in his Gospel Reflector in newspaper in Philadelphia, and Joseph said, yeah, definitely, and Sidney Rigdon agreed.
Oh, and so these were being published everywhere.
Yeah, all the church newspapers in Joseph's lifetime had it published in there, except for the Elders Journal, and that's because that had a limited run of, I think, only 4
Well, I
issues.
mean, you know how the Elders Quorum works. So
yeah, well, there's that too. I'm surprised anything happens, right? Especially now that it's a bunch of old guys. But anyway, so the point is, it was ubiquitous. Everybody knew.
Everybody was reading it. Yeah,
these letters.
And this is the thing. This is the thing too. We also have to take into account is Joseph and Oliver had conversations with each other. They had a conversation. Did Jerusalem have walls? Well, let's find out. I don't know. Let's inquire. Wasn't that what's that?
Wasn't that with Emma?
That particular one was with Emma.
Oh, I'm sorry. I don't.
It's a good point, Steve, because at one point in these letters, when Oliver was talking about the arrival of Moroni, he says, well, he always referred to Joseph Smith as our brother in these essays. But he said, our brother is unable to tell me what time of night it was, but it was after everybody went to bed. So he was obviously having a discussion with Joseph Smith about this when he was writing these letters.
And that's the thing too, is I believe that there's conversations have to be happening with Oliver and Joseph. And we also have to, I would say, if you're a faithful Latter-day Saint and you believe that every September Joseph goes up to the hill and he's educated and taught by Moroni, that you have to figure that some of the things that Moroni was telling Joseph was making it to Oliver's ears. And so the fact that this is published by Oliver, it's not refuted by Joseph Smith. And Joseph Smith was, I imagine that if I'm being taught by Moroni, I'm asking Moroni these very questions. So you're saying, and it's probably Moroni's description that Oliver Cowdery is giving when he says, you look out and you see out this plain, this is where the battle happened. I imagine that Joseph could have, I can imagine, Joseph probably had a similar statement, made a similar statement to Oliver, that then Oliver puts in these epistles.
Well, that's a good point, Steve. And he said it was in this mile-wide valley. If you just read the Book of Mormon and say this battle happened at Kimora, it could have been on the other side of the hill. It could have been at a greater distance. But he said it was in this valley between these two hills specifically. Now, the other element of all this that was quite interesting is another way Oliver knew that this was a fact was he'd been in the repository of Nephi records in the hill Kimora. He talked to Brigham Young about it, at least, and Heber C. Kimball and Wilford Woodruff reported on that. And what I find really fascinating, when you read Brigham Young's account of this, it was in his next to the last sermon before he died. And he specifically said, I'm going to relate this now because if I don't, it'll be forgotten in the church. And despite his effort to have it in the Journal of Discourses and being explicit about what Oliver Cowdery told him, it has by and large been forgotten in the church, just as he feared. And he said that Oliver didn't talk about it in meeting. In other words, he didn't talk about it publicly. And it makes sense that he wouldn't talk about it publicly. But and we could talk a lot about the plates and Kimora and all that. Let me just, because we're going to run out of time if I get into this much detail.
We've got 200 hours. Didn't we agree to that?
Oh, that's right. But just not consecutively.
Right.
Oh, that's right.
Yeah, don't forget that part.
Yeah,
So what I wanted to cover is just, let's say what I did as an experiment. I said, and it was actually my wife that instigated this. She said, all right, if Kimora's in New York, how does the Book of Mormon describe the geography? And she made a list of, I don't know, 200 or 300 passages that had some directions in it. So I took it on as a challenge. And I thought, well, rather than take the opinions of all these scholars about how the Book of Mormon fits, what if I use what Oliver Cowdery told us as the pin in the map? I said, okay, we know Kimora's in New York. How does the rest of it fit? And that's what I did. That's when I wrote that book called Moroni's America. Because when I look at this map that I showed you at the beginning here, this one.
Right. Uh-huh.
It fits all the descriptions in the Book of Mormon. And it's based on three theories or three principles, I guess, of interpretation. The first one is that the idea that land northward and land southward are relative terms, not proper nouns. And so those of you who are familiar with Salt Lake, if you're in Salt Lake, Provo is the land southward, right? And Logan is the land northward. But if you're in Provo, Salt Lake's the land northward, and St. George is in the land southward. So as a relative term, it shifts by where the speaker is, the land northward, the land southward. Because in other words, Salt Lake could be the land northward or the land southward, depending on if you're in Provo or Logan. So,
okay, so what we're talking about is not moral relativity, but geographical relativity.
Exactly. Yeah. Good way to put it. Okay. So it's just a relative term, depending on where the speaker is. That was the first principle. The second is the idea that let me back up. Everybody asks me when they talk about this geography, so where's the narrow neck of land? And I always say it's in Ether 1020, because that's the only place in the Book of Mormon that mentions the narrow neck of land. Where? And they say, no, it's all over the Book of Mormon. I said, no, it's not. If you read it carefully, there's a narrow neck of land in Ether 1020. There's a small neck of land, and there's a narrow neck, but it doesn't say of land. And so and
it's only in Ether?
Ether 1020, yeah. So when you look at that, there's three different terms. And so my hypothesis was there's three different terms because there's three different things. And when they say a narrow neck of land, it was to distinguish it from a narrow neck, which is often referred to as a waterway. You know, if you have a narrow passage of a waterway, that's a narrow neck also. And so that liberated me from this hourglass shape that everybody talks about all the time. And so, which doesn't even really fit in Mesoamerican anyway, but, you know, people try to find it down there. So along those lines, I was curious, what was the usage of those phrases in Joseph Smith's day? So I looked at the writings of George Washington and Thomas Jefferson and a few others. And when George Washington was talking about the Revolutionary War, he often talked about a narrow neck of land. And one of them was in the Hudson River. Yeah, there's an island on the Hudson River that he
now
had
you
fled
got
to.
the reference to where he's written.
Oh
that?
yeah, I have all that. Yeah, I can send it to you.
And that's in your book, Moroni's America?
No, this is in another book I did about Kimora.
You're going to cost me more money still?
It's included in the 3,000.
Okay, thank you.
No, look, Carrie, I'm glad you brought that up because, when I first got involved with this, I had no idea how much of a spouting whale I was about to become, because I thought I was going to do one book, and that turned into 3 books just on the times and seasons. Then I thought, okay, I'll do Moroni's America and I'm done. But then, of course, the harpoons came flying, and it just prompted me to search more and more and more. And I figured the more I dig into all these things, the better all Joseph Smith's narrative looks, at least for me. And this example of the narrow neck of land is a good one, because in Joseph's day, there were dozens of narrow necks of land.
Let me do something here. Now, I know this is not exhaustive, but
yeah,
I'm going to corroborate something you said about this narrow neck of land that to me honestly is surprising, because I thought the Book of Mormon was full of it too. Right. No, I'm full of the narrow neck of land, not full. I'm making RFM laugh. And okay, so I'm in the index in the LDS edition of the triple combination, and I looked under narrow. Okay.
Yep.
But that's it. Whoop, that's it. There's not much. It's just that small part right there. Right?
Yep.
There. It's just that small paragraph. Narrow pass is only once.
Narrow pass is different from the narrow neck of land.
Yeah. Well, I'm saying it's not full of the narrow neck of land here.
No.
That's not a major feature, apparently.
Nope.
Crap, I didn't know that. I've been going with the farms materials, being a former apologist. I was with the farm stuff, and so I studied with, Sorensen. I didn't study with Sorensen, but I did with Twetness and Matt Roper and those guys. And so, but I did not realize that there's a narrow gate, but that's in Second Nephi. That had nothing to do with it.
Right.
And there's a straight and narrow path that leads to eternal life, but that's not what we're talking about either.
Right, that's metaphorical.
I'm just showing you. That's interesting.
Yeah. Well, it was when I realized that there's only one narrow neck of land mentioned, and it was in the Book of Ether. I thought, well, why are we talking about this hourglass? I understand the rationale for conflating a small neck, a narrow neck, and a narrow neck of land, and a narrow passage as all being the same thing. You can make an argument for that, but that's just an assumption and interpretation. It's not what the text says. So I look at it and I say, well, why would they use 3 different terms for the same thing? And I started realizing, well, maybe they use 3 terms because there's 3 different things. And you're
saying like Washington and Jefferson did in their writing.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Not only that, I have other examples from church history too.
That to me was what really kind of cinched it for me, was because again, Jonathan's not afraid to engage Joseph Smith as a translator, not a dictator dictating things that he's reading off of something. Mm-hmm. So he's this idea of engaging the text with your world that you're in. And when he told me that narrow neck land is only mentioned once, and I always thought, isn't it interesting that only the Jaredites even use that term, the Nephites don't even use that term, and yet that one term seems to have affected the entire way people looked at the geography of the Book of Mormon for a very, very long time. And I thought, if they had known that in Joseph's time, narrow neck of land meant something more like what you described it, Jonathan, then that changes everything.
Yeah, it does.
It changes everything. And even those who believe in the hemispheric model, it changes that too. Yes, there are people back then that believed in the hemispheric model. And I talked to Brett Metcalf and Dan Vogel, and they both insist, and I respect them totally. But I think that what Jonathan's doing here is it's kind of like really opening my eyes to the other ideas that Joseph was dealing with. There's more to this text than meets the eye. And that's
Yeah.
what I find what Jonathan's been really to go to find that. So to me, that was like the biggest aha moment for me was when I came across that.
I'm open enough to look into this quite a bit more now that I just
Sure.
looked at that index one. So I'm looking forward. I honestly don't know one way or another. I will be talking to several different scholars about it, I'm sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, let me give you another example. So there's what I call a Sorensen translation. And I have these Mesoamerican guys tell me all the time, well, it talks right in there about a narrow strip of mountainous wilderness. And I said, no, it doesn't. And they said, yes, it does. And because John Sorensen wrote it that way. And I said, all right, you show me where it is. So, of course, they got out their Book of Mormon. They couldn't find it anywhere because Sorensen inserted the mountainous part. It's not in the text.
Where did he do that at?
In his writings and in all their Mesoamerican stuff, they talk about a narrow strip of mountainous wilderness because he assumed it had to be mountain. Yeah, but it really says a narrow strip of wilderness. So just like with the narrow neck of land, they conflated it with other terms in the Book of Mormon. They've also added terms like this mountainous adjective that is not in the text. So as soon as I threw that out, I said, well, what is a narrow strip of wilderness? And there's a lot of ways that could be interpreted. It could be a mountain. I'm not saying that's implausible or irrational, but there's other interpretations as well. And one that I think is persuasive to me is a wilderness is an uninhabited area. What's a narrow strip of uninhabited area other than a river? And particularly the Ohio River goes dry. It did before the dams, goes dry in the summer. And so it was a narrow strip of muddy wilderness nobody lived in, but it was a boundary, a border. Anyway, that's so the third element coming in connection with that is the idea that the Nephites traveled by rivers instead of walking everywhere, because no ancient people walked other than people living in the deserts, but people who lived in a jungle area or forested area used the rivers as their means of transportation. And we don't have a lot of discussion of that in the Book of Mormon, but Mormon specifically said, I'm not even going to have time to talk about our shipping and building of ships. So they were using the rivers. So once I put those three things together, using rivers, land northward, land southward is a relative term, and narrow neck of land is one feature, but it's not the same as a narrow neck or the small neck. It opened up the whole geography. The third, I guess, connected to that also was another assumption that I made that wasn't as categorical as those three, but it's the idea that there are two sea wests. And the reason I say that, the passage in Alma, two sea wests, because there's a passage in Alma that talks about, as I recall, it was the sons of Helaman or something that were down by the sea west south. When I saw that phrase, I thought, wait a minute, that means there must have been a sea west north also. And that fits with the geography. But okay, I guess I should explain also one more definitional term, and that is the term sea itself. Because I know the Mesoamerican guys are always saying, well, there's no sea west in this geography. And if you look at this map of the Midwest, we always think in terms of a sea as an ocean, and the Pacific Ocean isn't on here. So where's the sea west? So I was curious, and I looked up. You can see there's the Mississippi River here, right?
Right.
I don't know if you can see that, but it's right there. And I was curious how the Bible uses the term sea. And I looked in Strong's Concordance of all the uses of the word sea. And in Nahum and Isaiah, the word for the Nile River was translated as sea. So Strong says one of the definitions of sea, the Hebrew word for sea, is a mighty river. And I thought, well, that's the answer right there. Because then the Mississippi River qualifies as a mighty river. In fact, if you go along the Mississippi River,
yeah, but it doesn't flow north, does it?
No, and and there's a good reason. I'll get to the north flowing river if you want in a sec.
I was just thinking that's the objections I've seen. So
I know, another one of those objections. So we'll get to that. But
all right, okay, all good.
If you go up the Mississippi River, you start running into all the parallels to Egypt, right? Cairo, Ohio, is located at the conjunction or the confluence of the Ohio and Mississippi River. There's Memphis, Tennessee. There's several towns along the Mississippi named after the towns along the Nile River. And and in fact, when you go there in southern Illinois, it's still called Little Egypt, because it was back in the day, they were able to grow crops there when there was frozen in the north, and they saved the people in the north with their crops and so on. So they call it Little Egypt. Anyway, so all these things kind of came together, and I thought, all right, if we have the Mississippi River as the sea west, then this geography started to fit together. So the last thing I did is, just as an experiment, was I had the city of Zarahemla located across from Nauvoo. And I don't know if you know this, Gary, but in DNC 125, the Lord told Joseph Smith to build a city across from Nauvoo and name it Zarahemla. And he actually said, put the name of Zarahemla upon it, which tells me it was to be named after the individual Zarahemla, the name of Zarahemla, which was the first founder. And the Book of Mormon says that they always name the cities after the first founder. So
you mean the Zarahemla in the Book of Mormon,
right?
You're proposing that because that was revealed across from Nauvoo to be called Zarahemla, that would be the reason why. Okay.
Yeah. Now at this point, this was just a thought experiment, okay? Because I said, okay, we have a pin in the map in Kimora in New York, right. And if there's, let's say Zarahemla is across from Nauvoo, does this geography fit? And I was actually skeptical that it would fit, because, I've been raised as a Mesoamerican guy. Yeah.
Right.
And as I went through it, it started to unfold, and it fits. I think it fits perfectly, beautifully. And
I can't check into that. That's interesting.
Yeah, it's really interesting.
I've never heard of this before, so this is kind of cool.
But like I say, there's other theories too, and I'm fine with. This is where we get into the multiple working hypotheses, right?
Oh, yeah. I love that.
Yeah, because people can read the identical phrase and interpret it 180 degrees differently.
Well, just real quick, too, Jonathan, one of the things I think was really important is that you introduced the idea of multiple working hypotheses, okay? Mm-hmm. So now what comes from that is Thomas Murphy, one of the top anthropologists in the country, decides he's going to bring in one of his multiple working hypotheses using your model. And so he came on my program and gave his view of the Book of Mormon. He places the Book of Mormon setting in the 19th century context. That's when his multiple working hypothesis is. He's, in the sense, a Heartlander himself. And so he took it seriously enough to actually, and now that proposal that that thing that he did on my show, now he ended up being a paper that he co-authored with Sorensen, and credits my show acknowledges my show as being one of the factors for that. And my point being is that you're already having an effect on the serious academic community is taking you seriously, which I think is key, because a lot of people who are scholars they're publishing to each other, but they're not really in doing peer review. There's no evangelicals engaging the scholarships. There's no secular anthropologists like Thomas Murphy that are engaging you, that are engaging the other ones. So I think what you've done is you've actually moved the ball to have mature adult conversations. And rather than this become these wars that we've had, that it's become apologetics and it's not really scholarship.
You're taking away the fun.
No, Kerry, this is even more fun, though.
Well, I think it's fun.
It is, because it's good-hearted. We're all sincere. We're all just helping each other out. None of us are claiming perfection or we have all the truth and all that stuff as far as studying these things. Yeah. And so I think it's very healthy. I love it.
Well,
Go ahead, Kerry. Raise your hand.
Yes, because I apologize for interrupting you, but I did this with my former previous guest a couple weeks ago too, when they brought up the Hebrew. I looked up the Hebrew because I'm going to be quite blunt with you. I did not believe what you just told me. And now I can verify that what you told me is accurate. Isn't that cool? I'm in the Brown Driver Briggs Hebrew Lexicon. Okay. Granted, it's a dated one. It's old, but they keep updating it and bringing it up to date. And under the Yamim, the sea, the waters, the great waters, the great sea, mostly the Mediterranean, of course. We're talking biblical land, right? The Hinder Sea, the Back Sea, the Mediterranean, a particular part, the Red Sea. Come on, I just saw it. Hold on. The Sea of Salt, the Dead Sea. I just saw it. Oh, yes. Of a mighty river, the Nile.
There you go. Yeah.
There it is. Brown Driggs Driver, page 411. No joke. Neville's not just talking out his left ear.
You can look in Strong's Concordance online and see it real easy. You know, this is funny because
the Nile and the Euphrates, Jonathan.
Yeah, yeah.
And the Persian Gulf. How interesting. The shore of the sea, Yeah, no kidding. Okay. All right.
Okay.
You just went up in my estimation, Louis. If you're going to quote the Hebrew and you do that good, I'm with you.
You know what? I was with an evangelical archaeologist one time talking about this, and he was familiar with the Book of Mormon, and he said, "So where's the sea west?" And I said, "Well, it's the Mississippi." And he goes, "That's not a sea." And I said, "Yeah, it is. Look in Strong's Concordance." So he had Strong's Concordance on his laptop. He looked it up just like you just did. And he read that and he looked at me and he says, "High five." Give me a high five.
Hopefully, as the Germans will say. Well, I looked. Okay, so you're saying he looked up in the Strongs. I haven't looked it up in the Strongs yet, but I'm perfectly comfortable saying it's in the Brown Driver Briggs because that is standard Hebrew lexicon stuff there.
Yeah.
So there you have it.
I think it's important. And, just Jonathan, we're talking about multiple working hypothesis. Could you just kind of briefly describe to the audience, because they may be hearing this for the first time, what exactly is a multiple working hypothesis?
Yeah. Well, my approach to analyzing these things is based on what I call the faith model. And I actually did a little whiteboard, but I'll just explain it. So the idea is that there's facts, and facts are objective facts. And I consider them evidence of reality. Okay, I don't want to get too esoteric on this, but the idea is, for example, if you have a historical document, the existence of that historical document is a fact. Everybody can agree on that fact. Regardless of your other beliefs, we can agree that this is a fact.
Okay.
Now, to interpret that fact, we have to make assumptions. And that's where we start to diverge because we have different assumptions. And then we make inferences based on our assumptions that kind of fill in the blanks. Right. And then we come up with a theory to explain it all.
Right.
And from that theory, we develop a hypothesis to apply to additional facts going forward. And the example that I've used in my next book that'll be out in a month or two is from Lucy Mack Smith's history. And in her history, when she dictated the first version of it, she said that when Moroni first came to Joseph Smith, she said that he told her that the record was deposited in the hill of Kimora, and that Joseph needed to go there, remove the moss and leaves, and he'd find a stone, he could find it. And so there's three ways you can interpret that, essentially, based on your assumptions. If your assumption is that the Book of Mormon is fiction, then either Lucy was lying or Joseph Smith lied to her. That's your assumption. And then you make inferences and have a theory accordingly. Okay. If your assumption is that Kimora is not in New York, then you make the assumption that Lucy was repeating this false narrative about Kimora being in New York, or she was lying, either way. If you believe, and that leads you to your conclusion, or if you believe, if your assumption is that Kimora is in New York, then you accept what she wrote, and you make a theory accordingly. So it's another way of describing confirmation bias.
Let me know if I can help.
So,
okay, did I say Alexa or something?
Stupid computer does that every now and then.
Okay. So the point of this analysis is I think it's really crucial for us to agree on the facts, the objective facts that we can all see and agree to. For example, this definition of sea in Hebrew, and then identify our assumptions, because that's where we start to diverge, and that's where we can see. And it's not, the objective is not persuasion. We're not trying to convince anybody of anything. We're trying to understand one another better. And that's what is so commendable about Steve and his approach with Mormon book reviews. It's not a diatribe about trying to force people to believe something. It's to help people clarify what they really believe. And in my own view, the only way to do that is to start with facts that we can all agree with, and then we can explore why our interpretations vary. And my ideal scenario is to have a full range of working hypotheses. And the reason I say multiple is because we all have different ones. The reason I say working is they have to incorporate the facts somehow. And hypotheses is a rational interpretation of those working facts.
Okay.
So we can have multiple working hypotheses. It could be, everywhere from a virulent anti-Mormon critic to the staunchest, President Nelson in the church. And we all look at exactly the same facts, but we differ because of our assumptions and our inferences. And once we can get to that point, then I think people can make informed decisions. And they can say, well, I agree with this assumption, and here's why. And so then it follows from there. Or you can say, well, I don't agree with that assumption, but I see why you have that assumption. Steve and I have talked a little bit about this before. I've asked them, well, why do Christians accept the Bible? Because there's really no evidence of the events that took place in there. And they assume because of their traditions, basically, right? And their faith. But that's good, because some people will take that same Bible and say, I don't believe a word of it. I assume it's false. Other people assume it's true. Other people assume, well, part of it's true and part of it. But if you can agree to the fact and then lay out your assumptions, we can understand each other. There's no reason to argue about it or contend about it.
Interesting.
So, yeah. So let me mention one thing, though, as long as we're talking about geography. So Carrie sent me a link to a post from, I think it was 5 years ago on a particular blog. And I had zero recollection of that. To me, that's like ancient history 5 years ago.
I loved the whole comment section.
Yeah.
Neville, Land,
right.
Peter Pan or someone like that.
Yeah. Yeah.
The comment section went, if you was to print that stuff off, you'd have a book, man. And
I know. It was crazy.
I was impressed with the self-control you had in light of all of the vituperative comments against you.
well, you have to understand two things about that. First of all, this is not my job. And so I'm not defending my, my written repertoire of articles or what I've told thousands of students. I'm not defending any of that because I don't have an agenda there. And It's also not my career. I'm retired. I'm independent, so I don't need to worry about a boss or what, my supervisor or peer review or any of that is going to say. So I'm not aspiring to be hired by the church history department or whatever.
Right.
So there's that element, but then there's also an element of having practiced law, because when you practice law, you're in court, you argue with people. It's the same model, basically multiple working hypotheses. In that case, you're not really going towards an understanding. You're going to persuade a jury or a judge, but you still have to recognize that you're dealing with, everybody has the same facts. And it's how your assumptions and your interpretation of those facts that makes the difference. And I think too much in our apologetics, we haven't even agreed to the facts to begin with. And that should be the starting point. I don't think there's any justification for not accepting a set of facts because they're objective. We can all see them.
Go ahead.
So, so anyway,
I don't
getting back to this.
Off one of these.
That's all right. So getting back to this idea of interpreting the Book of Mormon to fit a geography makes sense to me because I start with the assumption that Oliver Cowdery told the truth. And not only because he was the assistant president of the church, but because he had personal experience in the Hill and with Moroni and with Joseph Smith and all that stuff. So to me, the most credible person on this whole topic is Oliver Cowdery, because Joseph didn't really talk about it that much, but he delegated the writing to Oliver Cowdery. And so that's why Oliver Cowdery was the hands-on publisher and so on. So I start with that assumption, and I'm happy I've declared that assumption pretty clearly, I think.
Sure.
And the people who disagree with the New York Kimora, their assumption is that Oliver Cowdery was either lying or mistaken. And they're a little vague on which that is, because they try to say, well, it was his opinion, but he didn't say it was his opinion. He said it was a fact. So he was either lying or mistaken. And that's fine. I just want them to be clear about what their assumption is so that we all know what we're talking about.
Okay.
I think Vogel would probably say that Oliver Cowdery was lying or, making it up. I don't know. I don't want to put words in his mouth, but that's the gist of what he's been saying all these years. And so there's a range of assumptions that people make. And the problem I've had with the apologists, the LDS apologists, is they haven't been willing to declare their assumptions up front. They just kind of hide it. They use sophistry to kind of bury it and pretend it's not there and so on. But if they want to come out and say Oliver Cowdery was either lying or mistaken and wrong, fine, let's have him say that. And then people can judge. Do you want to go with that, or do you want to believe Oliver Cowdery? And so what my point of all this is that if you accept my assumptions about interpreting the Book of Mormon, then the geography fits very well in North America. Of course, all my assumptions can be challenged and people can have different opinions. That's fine with me.
And I'm not in a position yet to challenge you, young man, but I will tell the books so I can.
Yeah, well,
I'm calling you young man because that will put me in your camp as a young man. I'm just saying. Not a lot.
Well, Carrie, it's like they say, it's very weird to be as old people are.
Yeah.
But I still play basketball. I still do all the sports, so I feel.
You do? Oh, dude, you got
Sure.
me. I have become too fat and sassy. However, I am working on losing weight now. All I have to do to lose 20 pounds of ugly fat is lop my head, but then I won't be able to talk very well. So I've got to.
Well, when you come out here, we'll play some tennis or something and help you.
Dude, I won't last 3 minutes. Give me a year so I can drop 50 pounds, and then I will.
Okay. All right. That's good. Anyway, the point about I appreciate you having me on the show. I don't know how much more time we have, but
3 hours.
3 hours.
Would you
But
like
I
to do a
come back on.
Would you like to do a question and answer session?
Sure.
To field a couple of questions. We're at about an hour and 15 minutes. We usually do about an hour and a half to 2.5.
Yeah, I think we talked before. I have another commitment in about 20 minutes. So, because we talked about doing an hour and a half tonight.
Yeah, right. And that's all good. We'll have you back and we can do maybe in the next one, we can do a further presentation of your stuff and do a longer Q&A. But if you guys, we can field a couple of quick questions. If you would type them in caps, I won't think you're yelling at Jonathan. It's all good. Would you type the questions in caps so that we can ask him a couple of questions and then we'll call it good. And we are planning, both Steve and I will host Jonathan again and again and again and again. This man has written over 50 books. He's been busy in this life. I've read 50 books, but I don't have the tenacity to write 50. But anyway.
Well, yeah, don't worry about reading anything other than my church.
Paul Osborne says he would love to have you back, so we will. And I know Paul is the gentleman that works on the Delmarva Peninsula over there in Chesapeake Bay area for the northern. The geography. I'm not saying he's a Heartlander either any more than you are, but just say now he says that it's because Joseph Smith had to have some kind of a landscape. He doesn't believe in the Book of Mormon, so he's saying that comes from his imagination, and it wouldn't matter to him whether the geography perfectly fits or not. The general basis of it is where he's just like you say, multiple working hypotheses.
Right,
okay,
exactly.
So Dan Vogel doesn't have any. Okay, how many 6-cent stamps in a dozen? Oh, fine, business operator. You are such a hoot. Okay, here we go. Debbie Donovan, hello. Welcome back, dear. Jonathan, what is the most important takeaway from your message, would you say?
I would say that, in my view, the extrinsic evidence corroborates the teachings of the prophets about the hill Kimora.
Now, when you say extrinsic evidence, what do you mean?
Extrinsic evidence. I mean, in terms of geography, geology, anthropology, and archaeology.
Oh, okay.
So that's extrinsic evidence outside of the religious realm. And I think that all corroborates what Oliver Cowdery said about the hill Kimora. That's the most important thing.
Interesting. Okay. So Heather Reddick, Hang on, we'll get another question here. Thank you, Heather. It's good to see you again, too. It's good to see all of you. I saw Fine Business Operator and Elisa Gallienne. Thank you for coming. Patty Cake, Lance. Here we go.
Wait, I see a question on here. Is this the one we're addressing?
Yeah, I'm just saying hi to everybody. I like it. What happened to the supposed golden plates? And please don't say that the angel Moroni took them to heaven or whatever.
Well, you don't have to ask me not to say that, because I would never say that. That doesn't make any sense to me. So,
ooh, you heard it here. Would you mind repeating that?
Yeah, it doesn't make any sense to me that Moroni would take them to heaven. I mean, they were a physical part of this earth.
Interesting.
So I wrote a whole book on this too, actually, Carrie.
What's the name of it, John?
It's called Whatever Happened to the Golden Plates. That's the title of the book.
Is that
is the title of the book?
$3,000 I'm going to spend?
No, that's an extra $1,500 for you.
No. So you don't think the angel Moroni took the plates?
No, of course not. Because here's the explanation. You probably haven't heard about the 2 sets of plates yet either.
I haven't.
I probably ought to explain. Should I explain that, Steve? I don't know if we have time, but
just give us a quick rundown, and we'll go into depth later.
The quick rundown of it is that when Joseph Smith got the plates from the stone box, those are the abridged plates, and the title page identifies them. The title page says what was in that set of plates. It says abridged record of the Nephites, abridged record of the Jaredites. Then Moroni sealed it with his little commentary at the end. So Joseph took the abridged plates down to Harmony, Pennsylvania, translated them all there. And remember when they lost the Book of Lehi. And so when he and Oliver got to the end of the record, they were thinking, well, let's go back and retranslate the plates of Nephi. And that's when the Lord said, no, don't retranslate that stuff. You have to translate the engravings on the plates of Nephi, but they didn't have the plates of Nephi in Harmony. And this has been kind of a misconception, in my view, all along, that there is only one set of plates. I'm saying, no, there were 2 sets of plates. And I show this through the scriptures as well as through the historical evidence. But the idea is that when they finished translating the abridged plates in Harmony, that's when the Lord told Joseph Smith through the Urim and Thummim to write to David Whitmer to have him pick them up and go up to Fayette, New York. Before they left Harmony, Joseph gave these plates to what he said was a divine messenger. And that guy took them. So when David Whitmer came down to Harmony to pick up Joseph and Oliver, they were riding back to Fayette when they passed this guy on the road, this messenger. Right. And David Whitmer asked him if he wanted to ride to Fayette. And the guy said, no, I'm going to Kimora. Remember that? Okay. And David remembered that. And this is when, as a lawyer, you look for indicia of reliability and credibility. And a lot of times that's in a detail. And David remembered specifically that was the first time he heard the word Kimora. So that has a lot of credibility that he remembered that specific event. So then they continued on to Fayette, and later the messenger brought the plates of Nephi over to Fayette for Joseph to translate. That's why he translated First Nephi through Words of Mormon in Fayette.
And you're saying that's a second set of plates?
Yeah, I'm saying the messenger took the abridged plates from Harmony back to Kimora, to the repository of all the Nephi records. And the Lord had told him Joseph has to translate the plates of Nephi. So he went through and found those plates of Nephi and took those to Fayette. That's why Joseph translated those in Fayette. Okay. Huh. So then after that, there's a lot to this, so we don't have time to get into it.
Yeah, but this is new to me, so this is quite
okay. So then it's interesting too when Joseph Smith showed the abridged or the plates of, I should say, I want to clarify. Let me start over. When Joseph Smith showed the plates to the 8 witnesses, his mother said that he got them from the messenger, which he did in Fayette. None of the 8 witnesses ever said there was a sealed portion in there. Joseph's father said he weighed those plates and they weighed 30 pounds. Other people said that the original plates were really heavy and weighed 60 pounds, 50 or 60 pounds. Right. So that's always been an area of for explaining the plates, people said, well, they had to be imaginary because there's different descriptions of them. But I think what happened is the 8 witnesses saw the plates of Nephi, which were smaller and didn't weigh as much as the abridged plates did. And then when after he showed them to the people, the 8 witnesses, Joseph and Oliver returned them to the hill Kimora. That's why they went into the repository that Oliver Cowdery described. Now, the next question is what happened to the plates?
Cave.
In the cave. Well, they called it a cave or a room.
The room.
I'll call it a room, a man-made cave, you could say, which would be fun to talk about someday. We don't have time to do it.
We will.
But so what happened in my view is when Brigham Young talked about this and Heber C. Kimball, they talked about this room being full of plates, right? And there was a shelf in there with plates on it, and they were stacked from the floor up. There's a table. But the way they talked about the quantity of plates was in terms of wagon loads. And I can't remember which one said one. One said more than a 6-mule team could carry. The other said several wagon loads of plates. And so when I was putting this all together and I realized, okay, there are 2 sets of plates, Oliver and Joseph took him back to the repository in the hill Kimora. Why would Brigham Young and Heber C. Kimball talk about wagon loads of plates unless Joseph and Oliver moved them? And I think that they moved them back to the hill Shem. And part of there's some corroboration of this. Oliver Cowdery said in letter number 8, he said the plates are no longer in Kimora, in the hill Kimora.
Right.
And David Whitmer was asked about this. He said, well, where are the plates now? And he said, well, they're in New York. And the person said, are they in the hill Kimora? And he said, no, but they're not far from there. And he said those adventurers from Rochester will never find them. And I put 2 and 2 together and I said, well, wait a minute. Okay, if Brigham Young and Heber Kimball were talking about wagon loads of plates, and Oliver Cowdery and David Whitmer said they were no longer in the hill Kimora, and we know the hill Shem was the repository before, and it wasn't that far away from Kimora because Mormon moved them all to the hill Kimora, then I think they moved them back to the hill Shem, and that's where they still are.
So where did this narrative come from? Where they say, oh, well, the angels took the plates back.
I haven't researched that. I don't know.
Killer.
Yeah, well, of course. I don't believe that. I mean, to me, that's a ridiculous idea because that gets into the whole stone on the hat thing. Why would we even need the plates if he just read words off his
and we have a question on that, which I promised Newton Lemnos. We will discuss that because I know just barely enough about Jonathan's idea that the stone in the hat he disagrees with. So
right.
The idea of not even needing the plates, Jonathan Neville has a different response to than what the Mesoamericanists say. And I promise we'll do another show, but I do want to get Richard Nygren, his question.
Okay.
Yes, do you think you will ever get in with Mike Parker over lunch?
I love that question.
And my response is yes, just as soon as Mike Parker quits imitating Steve Smoot, who keeps imitating Dan Peterson, and quit trying to be so blasted over intelligent and snot-nosed about it and talk like real scholars. That's when I would decide to sit down with you. But I've seen their comments, and I am singularly unimpressed with your attitude of denigration. And I also have another friend called Paul Osborne, who goes by the name of Shulam. If you want to fight, I'll put you up against him in this Mesoamerican theory, and quite frankly, he'll kick your ass from here to breakfast. So if we can be friends, that'd be great. That's
well, Carrie, let me answer this question. First off, I don't know Mike. I'm sure he's a great guy. You know,
he is. He's a wonderful man,
and
when
so
he wants to be.
But someone told me that he was the one going by Peter Pan.
Yeah, and he's admitted that apparently.
Okay.
I've seen the blog post. So it's good.
And for me, I like that pseudonym because Peter Pan never grows up, right? He's a child. And so to me, maybe if Mike is growing up enough to be rational and you know about it, I'd be happy to talk to him.
Yeah, that'd be great.
If you abandon the Peter Pan persona as well as the name, then we're in good shape. Because I feel like everybody is sincere. Everybody's trying to do the right thing. And I've acknowledged this many times, that when I first got into this, I was provocative. And part of that was
Sure.
because I read what they did with Rod Melbourne early on, where they were asserting all their credentials and their intellectual superiority and all this. And to me, that was outrageous. So I responded on behalf of Rod. And I feel like it was well-deserved. But there is also an element of persuasion involved with that, because if I had just come out and talked about what I think and not been provocative, this would have all been brushed aside. And by being provocative early on, obviously attracted the attention of Mike Parker and Dan Peterson and those guys.
Yeah.
It forced them to kind of address it. And it's funny because I read the Neville Land blog one time, and I thought, I don't want to give this any energy, and it's so juvenile anyway, it's not worth dealing with.
Right.
But people would email me their stuff anyway,
Oh, with
and I could tell frequently whenever they would blow up about some issue, the hits on my blog just skyrocketed because everybody wanted to know what they were talking about.
Sure.
Same with Dan. Every time Dan refers to it, I get a bunch more hits. And so I don't mind him doing it.
Well,
but again, I never really intended to be the spouting whale to get all the harpoons. But I'm happy to do it.
They probably never intended to be the gatekeepers and trying to get everybody else excommunicated who think differently than they think either.
Well,
so,
when you come up with a name like,
they give the brethren more headaches than heartwarmings, probably just like you guys do, because I think overall the church leaders probably just wish, one, either Jesus would finally come and tell us the truth about geography, where did it happen, or two, all the rest of us would quit worrying about it and just take it for its spiritual merits. The brethren, you guys, the brethren gray, Jonathan.
Well, today we had in our elders quorum, we discussed Elder Renlund's talk about Revelation. And one of the points he made in there was that the Lord won't reveal something that he's already revealed. That's why we have the scriptures. And as far as I'm concerned, the Lord told us a long time ago where Kimora was. And ever since the academics rejected that, we've been floundering around with these arguments and this nonsense about, speculating about Book of Mormon geography and all that in all different parts of the world and finding these quote unquote correspondences with Mayans. I mean, it's ridiculous on its face to me. And so, but it's a question the Lord answered all the way back in 1835. Actually, if you believe Lucy Mack Smith in 1823. And so why we're continually relitigating this issue is a perplexing thing to me, and it causes a lot of confusion. So I'm hopeful that as more and more Latter-day Saints, everybody involved with the Restoration Movement, even if they don't accept the Book of Mormon as scripture, but if everybody can go back and say, well, the people who had firsthand personal experience said this, who are we to say they were wrong? I mean, come on, it's ridiculous. And so there's all kinds of ways you can use sophistry to justify your rejection of what Oliver Cowdery said. But the bottom line is they're rejecting it. And of course it causes confusion. So anyway, I'm hopeful we can resolve it in a friendly way. And I'd love to meet Mike. And if he's more than welcome to come to Oregon.
I used to hang out with him and several of the boys in the fair conferences, which I miss. And we had a lot of fun. I had a lot of fun videoing those guys. I don't know if they'd ever let me back there because I wouldn't just sit there and nod my head yes to every presentation like I used to, but I used to love videoing them and interviewing them. So, the good old days.
I've gone to a couple of the fair conferences, and I feel like I'm in a bubble where nobody wants to come near me. It's so bizarre because I think they're great guys, great people.
They are.
But they don't even want to shake your hand or anything. They have this very defensive.
It's all right. The church in Jesus's day had self-righteous Pharisees too, so we've got to. So
I don't want to label anybody, but okay, I get your point. So.
I will. It's my show. So
it reminds me.
There you go.
There's hope, Jonathan, because
I know they can do like the self-righteous Pharisees in the New Testament and better themselves too. So,
Steve, what were you just saying?
Well, I was just going to say that for many years, when Sandra Tanner would attend the Mormon History Association, she had the same experience you had going to fair Mormon things. Now, the first MHA I went to, she was treated as a guest of honor and sat on a very prominent panel. So I don't know, Jonathan. I'm just saying maybe the same thing could happen where,
Yeah.
because this is the thing. The whole reason I started this channel was to be a safe space where people can
Right.
come and bring their ideas.
Exactly.
I even tell people, if the Heartlander model was the dominant model, guess what? I would be having Mesoamerican people on my program to talk about it, because I feel it's important that all these different voices are heard. And so, and I just find you to be a fascinating dude. You're an original thinker. You're actually, and you're also engaging evangelicals. They're getting in touch with you. You're talking to them.
Yeah,
You're building bridges. You're doing the very thing the church wants to have done. Whereas the other approaches have been off-putting. There are no evangelicals that engage them at all. But yet you're talking to evangelical scholars. And so I think that's the beautiful thing about what we're doing here, is we're actually building bridges, because in this society we live in, we need to be talking to each other. That's the main thing.
Absolutely.
That's true. And we're doing that. I would be happy to have any of the Mesoamerican scholars on here and let them share their information as well. Sure. And I think that'd be fun. I think I know their theory a little better than yours. So it's hang on. Hang on just 1 second. This is an important phone call.
Okay.
Hello.
Oh, he's going to put it on the speakerphone.
Hey, what? I'm on delay. Oh, hey, this is Dan Vogel.
Dan Vogel.
Okay.
Okay.
Oh, I can't see them all. Can you hold on? Let me look.
You know what, Carrie? I'm getting overtime. I'm going to have to leave, but I'd be happy to do more questions another time.
Okay, yeah,
I've got about 3 more minutes.
Yeah, he's only got 3 more minutes. Then he's got to go on another engagement. So keep track of that question, and he will be happy to. We'll have him on again here shortly, tomorrow morning at 6 a.m. or something like that. Oh no. But yeah, hang on to that. Okay, I'm going to close this out and I'll call you later. Thanks, Dan. See, my audience, they rock. They care about this. They're awesome, man.
That's awesome. I like it. Yeah.
Yeah, he said both him and RFM had questions. And RFM, you too, if you'll keep track of that question, please. And all of you, whoever you are, keep track of your questions. We'll be happy to have Jonathan back. So, and next time we'll have a longer question and answer period. We just wanted to get.
I love the Q&A. In fact, we could even start off with Q&A if you want.
Hey, we could do a full 2
as
hours
a follow-up to this, and then move into the translation or whatever happened to the plates or whatever. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
So before we go, Steve, do you have any last words of wisdom you'd like to share?
Well, I just want to say that, you and I, we all got on a Zoom call yesterday, and I thought it was a real positive, edifying conversation that we all had. And we all come from different perspectives and different worldviews. And I think that people can also see the same spirit was here tonight. And whether you're atheist, whether you're, evangelical, TBM, progressive, nuanced, it really doesn't matter. That we can actually talk. A former apologist, man. And man, getting to know you, Carrie, has been a real blessing to me in my life.
Cool.
I love you, brother.
Oh, and tell me more.
And it was great to spend some time with you when you came out to the movie screening. But also I tell people one of the proudest things that I did with my channel was that I gave Jonathan, he kind of was just viewed as this Heartlander guy. And he was kind of in that ecosystem in many ways. He had done some other stuff, but I got him because I said, I recognize as an outsider, as somebody who doesn't have a dog in this fight, I thought he had something very important to say. I thought he did a lot of original research that needed to be taken seriously by scholars. And so, and then having you on this forum with Jonathan on this forum, I think has been great. I want to thank you for affording this to me, giving me the opportunity to be a co-host and affording this opportunity to Jonathan to actually truly engage. Dan Vogel's on the phone. RFM wants to talk to you. I guarantee you Thomas Murphy and all these other people are want to engage Jonathan Neville. Isn't that interesting, folks? They want to talk to Jonathan and they have questions for him. I think that's good.
Well, they're pretty hardcore skeptical too. So this will be a great way to see both sides. Yeah. By proving contraries, truth is made manifest. So.
That's right.
Okay. So Jonathan, do you have any last words you'd like to say before we close out?
I think I've said more than enough.
Oh, I don't.
We've only just begun.
Let me tell you, I will say you guys are fun to work with. To have conversations with. I love the spirit of this. I like the approach that we all share of multiple working hypotheses and focusing on understanding rather than trying to convince somebody of something. Sure. To me, it's almost when people try so hard to convince somebody, to me that exemplifies their insecurity. You know, it's like they're not comfortable with their own beliefs. They have to have numbers to justify it or something. And I think it's more important for us to all understand where we're coming from, and then find common areas that we can work together to make the world a better place. And so I love what you guys are doing. I'm glad to be part of it, and I encourage us all to move forward.
Yep. Thank you. That's very, very, very well put, both of you. And yeah, we are in the process of having, that's what we're all about. Conversations, discussions. Don't worry about arguments and converting people to your point of view. Let's explore. Right. I'm going to use the wonderful metaphor that they gave to Hugh Nibley. I will give it to you, Jonathan Neville, and I say this as a compliment. Nibley had the metaphor, or Farms had the metaphor of Hugh Nibley, that he was, it's true, he was a hop, skip, and jump scholar, but what he was doing was he was going through a great big gigantic motel, opening doors, looking in and saying, oh, hey, that's interesting. Then he would go to the next door without exploring the room in depth, and he would open doors for others. That's what we're trying to do. Something to that effect anyway.
I like that one. Yeah, that makes sense. I like that metaphor.
So, okay, everybody, thank you so much for your attendance. We appreciate y'all. We will be back next week. I will have Rebecca Biblioteca and Jordan from Mormonish. We have a heck of a subject. Don't forget Wednesday night, Mormonism Live. We are going to get out of here. I love y'all. Be good, do well, have fun, work hard, stay friends, and I'll see you next time. Heck yeah, baby. Yeah, baby.